Austria has just had a general election. That's all great, but in this video I'm going to show you that the result of the election does not matter at all. And the reason is that the democracy in Austria has always been deeply flawed in the first place. Now, this is not to say that the politics in Austria does not matter or that you shouldn't care about the result of the election. Quite the contrary, actually. What happens in Austria does have an enormous impact on the rest of the region. And in fact, the self-styled experts have been telling you how consequential the election really was, and they're not wrong. And judging by the fact that you clicked on this video, you probably care about politics in Austria too, at least a little bit. Or if you've misclicked and wanted to in fact see cute kittens or whatever, I'm sorry for you. But you might as well stick around when you're here already. You see, the real problem with Austria is that its politics and democracy was already quite bad before the election. This is Progpals, I'm Jan, and I've spent my entire professional life focused on politics in what I call the heart of Europe. Today, let's talk about how Austria became a corrupt clientelist state, which is much less similar to Western Europe, to which it would love to belong, and much more similar to the east of Europe, even Russia. As always, if you like what I do, please consider hitting that like button and subscribing to the channel. It really does help us grow. And also thanks to everyone supporting me on herohero.co/progpals. Now, let's dive in. Now, listening to the so-called media pundits all around the world, you would almost believe that corruption and clientelism is something that is only reserved to the so-called new democracies in the East and does not happen at all in the so-called Western democracies. And surely those new democracies have been having a lot of corruption problems themselves. Hell, in the heart of Europe, corruption has often been the reason why the whole political system collapsed and entirely new parties emerged. As an example, take a look at the Olano party of Igor Matovic in Slovakia or the ANO party of Andrej Babiš in Czechia. ANO, for its part, showed up to power in 2013 on the promise of cleaning up the system after wide-scale corruption. Just a few years after that, both of those parties actually either faced corruption allegations themselves, or they screwed up so badly while in government that they allowed the cozy return of the parties that they promised to get rid of in the first place back to power. And of course, if we go further to the east, for example Russia, we see entire states built on clientelist connections and corruption. Without them, the states would probably collapse altogether. But pretending that corruption is something that only happens in the East would be entirely arrogant and also completely untrue. Austria, for one, which most experts would still insist on calling Western, definitely stands out in terms of corruption and the number of scandals that the country has gone through since the war. In fact, the scandals that the country has had is some Netflix level shit. And there are deeply rooted reasons for that. For one, ever since the 1950s, the entire country has been divided among the two largest political parties, the Austrian People's Party, or the ÖVP on the one hand, and the Austrian Social Democratic Party, or the SPÖ on the other hand. Yes, there's going to be a lot of German pronunciation in this video, so bear with me. Those two parties regularly dominated the entire political system in Austria, and the extent of the dominance is unheard of anywhere else in Europe. That in itself wouldn't be the biggest problem, don't get me wrong. After all, we see many two-party democratic systems in Europe. The real problem starts when those two parties, who together get something like 85 to 90% of all votes, start governing together, rather than one party being in the government and the other being the democratic opposition. Once those parties start governing together in a so-called grand coalition, they can, and often do, come up with a sophisticated system to basically capture the whole politics and the whole economy of the country, to capture the entire state. Which is exactly what happened in Austria. The two parties, the ÖVP and the SPÖ, governed basically as one party in total unison. And they proportionately divided the influence, the power, and the economic benefits in the entire country. To give you an idea, senior staff, or friends or cronies, if you will, of both parties were installed to important positions of power in all imaginable sectors of the economy and the country's politics. This, of course, included ministries, state-owned companies, and even the public service media in Austria. What this system created was basically the fact that you don't have to win an election It is enough to participate in an election, and then you get positions of power proportionate to the number of votes that you get. You might not see it at first, but this is actually an important difference to how democracies work normally. You see, at least in continental Europe, you get seats in parliament proportionate to the number of votes that you get in an election, not in government. Basically, the more votes you get in an election, the more seats you have in parliament. And then when you're able to build a majority in parliament, you are able to govern in government, either as a single party, which is quite rare in Europe, or in a coalition. And that coalition that manages to secure the majority of seats in parliament based on the result of the election then is able to govern. And then the opposition controls the government within the parliament. But the system was different in Austria. Under the system, which even has a name in German, because of course it does,
Proporz.
If you're one of the two largest parties, you are guaranteed to have representation in government, and also you're part of the influence, proportionate to how many votes you've got. Actually, the system, which has been developing ever since the war, has been so elaborate that often you already knew what exact functions and what exact positions you would get even before the election itself took place. And because Austria is a federal country, this system also applied to the states themselves, not only to the federal level in the country. Heck, the Proporz system was even written in the constitutions of some of those states, and at least for two, it still is written in that constitution today. So, as you probably understand already, under this system, basically any sort of meaningful opposition in Austria has been eliminated, because you are guaranteed your positions of power if you are one of the two largest parties. So there was basically no motivation to honestly and genuinely participate in an election and try to win the majority, because you are going to sit in the government no matter what happens. Yes, elections in Austria still were free and fair on paper, but that doesn't change anything, because for a truly functioning democracy, what you really need is a genuine opposition. And under this system, you could very well make the argument that the opposition was not genuine, in fact, because you get your share of power, you get your share of profits, so why should you try to be a genuine opposition in the first place? And you don't have to be a rocket scientist to see that a genuine opposition does help the quality of democracy. Besides, out of basically all regions in Europe, this region, the heart of Europe, has seen what it means when an opposition does not exist and what a one-party state can lead to. Now, grand coalitions have not been the exception in Austria, quite the opposite. Ever since the war, they have become the rule. Out of all 31 governments that have taken office since the war in Austria, 20 have been grand coalitions. And some of those ran for a very long time without interruption. As an example, we had a grand coalition from 1945 till 1966, from 1987 to 2000, and then from 2007 to 2017. Now, why the hell have we spent so much time so far explaining such a niche thing about the history of Austrian politics, you might ask? Well, I'm not trying to bore you to death, I promise. But you could make the argument that under the Proporz system, because it was so institutionalized, there was no point holding a free election altogether. Yes, I'm being harsh, but you hopefully see why. Yes, the system has arguably become much less rigid now, because some new parties, such as the Freedom Party of Austria, the FPÖ, or the Liberal Neos Party, have managed to break through, but still, a lot of appointments are still, either officially or unofficially, being made based on party lines and based on the historical Proporz system. And now we get to the main point of this video, because you see, the Proporz system has been going on for so long that it has created an ideal breeding ground for, you guessed it, corruption. And the reason is actually quite simple. You see, when you have no meaningful opposition, and you've captured all important positions of power, including economic positions, such as those in state industries generating large revenues, you have no motivation whatsoever to hide your intention to steal money. Because there is no opposition, so no one to really check what you're doing, and you're so powerful that you can either eliminate or seriously weaken state institutions such as law enforcement. And if shit really does hit the fan, you can pressure law enforcement and the media into obedience. You might think that it sounds harsh and that we're talking about Austria, the Western European democracy, but bear with me, because this is exactly what has been happening in Austria. In fact, there has been a fair share of corruption scandals, and many of them look like something that a B-quality Netflix production could shoot. Just a few examples. In the 1970s, a very well politically connected Viennese businessman called Udo Proksch came up with a sophisticated plan to get rich. He hired a cargo ship, loaded it with useless scrap materials, pieces of metal basically, and claimed that this useless material was in fact very expensive uranium mining equipment, and had the ship insured for a large sum of money. At that time it was around $20 million, which in the 1970s was a lot of money. And then Proksch used his political friends, such as the Minister of Defense at that time, Karl Ludgendorff, to supply explosives to the ship. And you know what's coming? There was a big bang, the ship sank, and 6 people were killed in the explosion. And Proksch claimed money from the insurance for the fake expensive uranium equipment, which had never been there in the first place. And when the conspiracy was uncovered, it became the biggest political scandal in Austria at that time, with 16 high-ranking politicians from all parties somewhat implicated in the scandal. Some of them were even convicted. That included, for example, the Speaker of the Parliament at the time, the second highest-ranking position in Austria. And Ludgendorff, the Ministry of Defense who supplied the explosives to the ship, later committed suicide. Sounds like a bad action movie? I would say so. More recently, investigators uncovered that lobbyists for the Eurofighter aircraft maker paid about 100 million euros, so a shit ton of money, to politicians in exchange for the country's 2 billion euro order of new fighter jets. That happened in 2003, and just last year, prosecutors actually filed charges in the case for money laundering. Again, high-ranking politicians have been implicated in the case. We're not stopping there. In 2019, there was this infamous meeting between then Vice-Chancellor Heinz Christian Strache from the FPÖ and someone who he believed was a niece of a Russian oligarch. In fact, the whole thing was a setup, and the woman was a private investigator. On tape, Strache is seen promising the woman political influence to Russia in exchange for money to the SPÖ and the governing coalition at that time, which also included the ÖVP. We've also reported on the scandal in a previous video, which you should see on the screen somewhere here right now. Be sure to check it out later. And lastly, former Austrian Chancellor Sebastian Kurz, who was considered a sweetheart and a hope for the future for the European conservatives, has been implicated in a large corruption scandal himself. It seems that even before becoming chancellor, he had been bribing a well-known Austrian tabloid newspaper to publish completely fabricated polling numbers about his popularity. He also pressured the church into obedience and later secured a cushy job for a man named Thomas Schmidt, who was basically his sidekick and doing all the dirty work for him. That job that Kurz secured for his friend paid a nice sum of 600k a year. And to top it all off, when all of these corruption scandals of the ÖVP started to bubble up, leaked recordings show that the party had been trying to cover them up by pressuring prosecutors to drop or delay investigations into the party. And to try to pressure the prosecutors into obedience, Kurz didn't use any random sidekick, he used none other than Wilhelm Sobotka, Speaker of the Austrian Parliament and a longtime party member of the ÖVP. A former high-ranking prosecutor, Christian Pilnacek, revealed in a leaked recording that those two had been pressuring him to drop his investigations. And in 2019, Pilnacek himself was found dead and probably committed suicide. Now, I could go on and on about how deep Austria has been in corruption, but there's honestly no point. There's one thing I want you to remember. No matter if you consider Austria West or East, the fact of the matter is that the country has been no stranger to corruption and a fair share of political scandal that even some of the traditionally Eastern countries wouldn't be ashamed of. Or, I mean, they would be. But, you know, you would traditionally associate those scandals with the East. Honestly, This kind of drama, and I've just given you a few examples, there's much more, so let me know if you would be interested in those. I can make a video on them later. This drama would be hardly rivaled anywhere else in civilized Europe. Plus, the whole patronage system, the purport system, if you will, has been going on for decades. Going back to the 2024 election, you see, it does not matter at all which party did win in the end. Because yes, the FPÖ did secure its first ever historic win, but the fact is that nothing will change in the system that I just described, even if the FPÖ has won. The roots of corruption and clientelism are simply so deep that a single election, no matter who wins in the end, just cannot change it. It has been going on for decades, as we've described. The SPÖ and the ÖVP will still cling to power, either formally or informally, both in the federal and on the state level. Because let's not forget that Austria is, after all, a federal state, where much of the power, again, quite intentionally, lies with the states, not with the federal government. And in the states, both the ÖVP and the SPÖ are still dominant. In all 9 Austrian federal states, either the ÖVP or the SPÖ has its prime minister. In 6 of the states, the ÖVP dominates, and the remaining 3 are dominated by the SPÖ. And in all of them, those parties govern together. Now, this does not mean that we should ignore the win of the SPÖ or that we're questioning the win. No, the party has won, and we should be paying attention to it. There's no question about that. And honestly speaking, seeing this whole sophisticated system of corruption, it's probably understandable that people wanted to vote for a change and saw their vote probably as a protest vote against the establishment composed of the ÖVP and the SPÖ. But let's not forget that the FPÖ, who has now won, is no stranger to corruption itself. Remember our guy, Heinz Christian Strache? Well, he was vice-chancellor for the FPÖ and was the party leader at the time that the scandal surfaced. But the party, now with a new leader, Herbert Kickl, somehow still managed to convince the voters that it is their genuine protest vote against the government.
Wir haben eine Tür aufgestoßen zu einer neuen Ära. Wir werden jetzt wirklich dieses neue Kapitel der österreichischen Geschichte miteinander schreiben. Wir haben das verinnerlicht, dass es gilt zuerst das Volk und dann der Kanzler.
The Austrian election, which the FPÖ dominated, is important precisely because the FPÖ has some questionable stances on Russia. They want to, for example, abolish all sanctions against the terrorist regime in the Kremlin, who unjustifiably attacked Ukraine, and they want to continue trading with the regime. And also, let's not forget that the FPÖ is genuinely a party that was established by an SS and a Nazi officer. And I'm not even making this up. So the party could hypothetically be dangerous to Europe and Austria itself. But the FPÖ is still rather unlikely to govern anyway, because all of the other parties have now ruled out wanting to govern with the FPÖ, and the margin between the FPÖ and the ÖVP is not that large anyway. And even if the FPÖ ends up in government in the end somehow, it is basically impossible that the party will name its own chancellor. Because in order for that to happen, the Austrian president would have to agree, and he had already ruled that out in the past. So it is very likely that nothing much will change in terms of how and by whom Austria is governed. And by the way, if I want to be harsh again, all of the Austrian parties, including the ÖVP and the SPÖ, have had a cozy relationship with Russia. So it's not just the FPÖ that's a danger. So, feel free to debate the results of the Austrian election how you want. The fact of the matter is that it will most likely not change much in terms of how Austria is being run. Because the result simply does not matter. Very likely, the situation in Austria will not change, and corrupt politicians with strong links to Russia and clientelist interests will still stay in power. Because this was just a federal election and Austria is a very decentralized state, both the SPÖ and the ÖVP will still continue to dominate in the Austrian states, so nothing will change there at all. The two parties will still more or less secretly continue to admire Russia, and the Austrian democracy will still continue to be dysfunctional due to the Proporz system. So this is how the election does not matter. What does matter, on the other hand, is that the rise of the FPÖ, which is unquestionable, does send an important signal to the rest of the region. Not least because the rise of the FPÖ, which we've now seen, could speed up the rise of a Russia-tolerant, corrupt, and conspiracy-prone zone in the heart of Europe. And Slovakia is a prime example, where it's been a year only since the election, and the country's democracy is already in ruins today. We've discussed that multiple times on this channel before, so do check the videos out. And next year, Czechia could follow suit because it faces a highly anticipated general election where Andrej Babiš, who is now more and more prone to conspiracies himself, could very well return to power. You can call Austria Western all you want. The fact is that it is much more Eastern in terms of its political culture than many so-called experts would like to admit. Be that as it may, please let's drop the labels of Western versus Eastern. It does not make any sense anymore. We will definitely be watching the region further, including Austria, of course. But I think the conclusion is as follows: don't despair, because the situation had already been bad before the election, so nothing much has changed there, right? The real question we should be asking ourselves is how to improve the political situation, and not only in Austria, but also elsewhere in the region going into the future. What should we do? Let's see about that. Hopefully even our videos could provide at least part of the answer going forward. This has been Jan with Pragpulse. Thanks again for subscribing to the channel and liking this video, and thanks again for everyone supporting me on herohero.co/Pragpulse. Thank you so much, I really appreciate all your support. Have a great one and see you next time.